Good morning, everybody. My name is Darcy Wilson-Reimer. I'm the Managing Director for Starbucks for the UK and Ireland, and I'd like to welcome everybody here to our store here at Oxford Street, and thank everybody for your time and turning up to this debate on big business and ethical sourcing. For those of you in business or perhaps even in personal lives, these are tough times, and things aren't as easy given where the economy's at, given where business is at. But having recently got back from a trip from Tanzania, visiting some coffee farmers, I can assure you that any of the tough decisions that we have to make are nothing in comparison to the decisions that farmers have to make that are earning $300 a year. And I stood on this junction on a road in Tanzania, and basically there was a coffee farm on this side of the road that had abundant plants. It was very well kept, great crop yields, and a farmer that was extremely happy, whose kids were going to school, that had access to medical attention. And on this side of the road, there was a farm with very low yield. The health of the trees was not that great. And the decision that this farmer had to make was to perhaps reduce their yield by 50% for 3 years in order to replant and to gain a healthy plants, healthy trees in order to get their yield up. And that's a pretty tough decision, to have your income from $300 a year to $150 a year. And that's the difference between access to health, access to education. Now that's a really tough decision, and one that I would hate to make. And it's with that I can say that at Starbucks we're not neutral on this, on the topic of ethical sourcing. We have a long history of putting in the right supply chain. And I think above all, what the responsibility of large business is to do is to use their scale for good. And so I'll just finish there. I'm going to introduce you to Oliver Morton, who's our chair. And Oliver is the Energy and Environment Editor at The Economist. And he's going to introduce you to the panel. So turn it over to Oliver.
Thanks very much indeed. I think I'm good for that. Thank you, good morning. It's very impressive to see you all here, appropriately stimulated. It seems to me that more or less the only thing that anyone will ever remember a chair for is if everyone dies, and on that basis I'm going to point out that the fire exits are over there and thus fulfill my statutory duty. You have no seatbelts, nor tray tables. There's only a slight change to the published schedule, a published schedule which may indeed have been published only to me by Policy Exchange. But we're going to have two of our speakers first, and then we're going to have a sort of like initial clearing our throat, urgent Q&A, and then we're going to have a third speaker. This is because our first speaker, Jeremy Lefroy, who's an MP, has to go and govern us at 9:15. It's obvious that it's obvious from your attendance that this is an issue that commands a great deal of attention. It's also fairly obvious from inspection that we know that fair trade is about narratives which go, as I'm rather movingly said, to hard questions for poor people about what they should do with their resources, and questions to all of us collectively about how we can best help them in those situations and help them escape the poverty that makes those situations so pressing and dreadful. So that tends to focus us on the personal, which in the way that most of us look at the world tends to raise a slight contrast, a slight tension, when we also think in terms of big business, which we typically think of as impersonal and indeed sometimes implacable. And so bringing these two things together is obviously going to lead to a certain sort of clash of context, maybe. At the same time, I think we all realize that since most people buy an awful lot of the stuff they consume from big companies, without some sort of involvement between ethical sourcing organisations and big business. Ethical sourcing will always be a very niche sort of opportunity. And so we have three people here to speak to us about their take on the, I suppose, on the threats and opportunities of the relationship, the necessary relationship between ethical sourcing and big business. We're going to start with Jeremy Lefroy, who, as I said, is an MP. He's actually on the International Development Select Committee, which is what will be taking him away from us. But he also has direct experience of these issues as having worked in the coffee industry in Tanzania. He's the MP for Stafford, and he'll speak to us for about 10 minutes now.
Thank you. Can I actually use that? Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm most grateful to Policy Exchange for organising it and to Starbucks for hosting it. I think because I'm a businessman who happens to have ended up in Parliament, what I want to do is answer the question at the beginning. So big business and ethical sourcing and contradiction in terms, the answer is no. Shall I sit down? I'll explain a little bit. My background, as Oliver has said, is in, I've been in the coffee business for about 25 years and was involved from a reasonably early stage also on the fringes of the Fair Trade movement, which I've become increasingly involved in since. And what I'm going to do is, in a very few minutes, give a very sort of down-to-earth practical view of how I see it from my perspective as somebody intimately involved on the private side of the coffee business, but working very closely with small farmers, as Oliver said, particularly in Tanzania, but also more recently in Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, and one or two other countries. And what I would say, what I want to do first of all is also talk about what is this ethical sourcing. Well, it now covers quite a wide range of so-called certifications, right from fair trade itself, through organic, through Rainforest Alliance, certified, and of course Starbucks' own in-house cafe practices. I've had experience of all of these, and I think all of them have a contribution to make, but I want to just say one thing right at the very beginning. I don't believe any of the other certifications would have come about without the fair trade movement and without the kind of success that fair trade, and particularly under Harriet here and her colleagues and in other countries across the world, has had in the UK. I think they've taken the lead, and they to a large extent are the gold standard in all this. And I think we shouldn't forget that, because other certifications may come and may go, but I think fair trade must always be there as the bedrock of the ethical sourcing movement. I'm just going to concentrate on three questions, and they'll all begin with one letter so that I can remember them. The first is competition, the second is cost, and the third is continuity. Is ethical sourcing anti-competitive? I would say absolutely no. And the reason I would say this is that if you look at where ethical sourcing is done, for instance, Starbucks in Tanzania, you have a number of organisations involved in the purchase of coffee, many of whom may be certified by Starbucks Cafe Practice, may be certified FLO, organic, or whatever. So farmers do have a choice. Now, it may be a restricted choice in some circumstances, because not every farmer, not every buyer may have cash at the right time in the right place. The logistics are sometimes very difficult. There may be only one buyer there on a certain day, but there is competition, and I've seen that at first hand. Of course, there is another type, if you like, of ethical sourcing, where a company will go into an area and work with small farmers who have no other buyer because it's very remote, and will say, we will take your produce. If you work with us, we will supply you with the technical input, we will supply you with finance and so on. And I saw an example of this in a very, excuse me, in a very different business in Uganda at the beginning of January, where I visited health projects run by Nile Breweries, which is owned by SAB Miller. There, they were working with small farmers to produce sorghum and barley for their breweries. And again, they were pretty much the only buyers. But because they were the only buyers, they took responsibility to ensure that the terms on which they bought were pretty fair, and I was impressed with that. But of course, that is a very different situation. And big companies which are in those sort of situations where they are the only buyer because basically nobody else is around to buy the product, nobody wants the product, or it's too remote for them to have the logistics to get there, they have a great responsibility to ensure that they are providing fair terms, and that may mean extra scrutiny from the outside. The second C is cost. I've been through the cafe practices procedure of Starbucks. I've spent hours, dozens of hours, sweating over spreadsheets trying to do it, as have my colleagues. And I congratulate Starbucks for what they've done. They really, in the case of our business, they were the first people to pick up the coffee that we were producing, and without doubt, we wouldn't have done what we did without Starbucks. At the same time, these processes are pretty expensive. You have to get people in from the outside. Not only that, you have the cost of your own people spending all these hours producing the work, particularly if you're dealing, as we were, with 50 to 100,000 individual small farmers. And one thing I think that ethical sources need to look at is how that cost is borne. Firstly, we have a number of certifications going on at once. We need to consolidate them, or at least enable there to be some kind of provision for a certification visit to cover several different certifications, UDS, cafe practices, rainforest alliance and so on, because there's plenty of overlap. Instead of having everybody in doing their own individual certifications, taking up a lot of time. So I think we need to look at cost, because if cost is not kept down on certification, I think FLO has a very good track record on this. If it's not kept down, then you will end up with anti-competitive practice by default, because most people won't be able to afford the cost of the certification, and therefore you will only have one or two players in the market. And the third C is continuity. This, to me, is absolutely vital, and this was made clear in the notes for this meeting today. If you don't have continuity, you run into big problems. I'll give you one example. We were working with one particular company on cocoa, who I have to say had been excellent over many, many years, but they came to a situation where they couldn't continue to buy an organic product from us. So they said, right, we're going to stop because our stocks are just too high. They stopped. We tried to continue buying from our farmers. There were other competitors in the field that we tried to continue, but we in the end had to stop because we simply couldn't afford to go on. As soon as we pulled out, the price in the field dropped by about 20%, even though there was competition there. I'm glad to say we explained the problem immediately. That buyer came straight back and said, okay, well, we will take the risk, we will build up stocks if necessary, but we want to ensure that this is for the long term, and all credit to them. And that was 7 years ago, and they've never let us down at all in that period. But continuity is absolutely vital. Buyers, farmers, and the buyers who buy the coffee from them will accept, I think sometimes, slightly lower prices if they see a continuity and a relationship which is there, which is taking away their risk over a number of years. But that's a kind of relationship that has to be established and has to be nurtured. And that's why I come back to the importance of fair trade as being, if you like, the gold standard in these ethical sourcing relationships. Because everybody thinks about fair trade as being about price. It's not. Price is one element of it. A far, in my view, more important element is that long-term relationship which fair trade organisations establish with their suppliers over many, many years. And I think if an organisation remembers that continuity of relationship, a fair relationship, whether it's a huge business or a small business, it won't go very far wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Our second speaker is Harriet Lamb, who is Executive Director of the Fair Trade Foundation and has an extensive background in a number of different NGOs. She also has some background in developing countries where she spent part of her childhood in India. Harriet.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. And I work at the Fair Trade Foundation, and for those of you who don't know, Fair Trade was actually started about 20 years ago, first by Mexican coffee farmers getting together with citizens in the Netherlands at the time of the coffee crisis, when prices had just crashed and farmers weren't getting for their coffee what it even cost them to grow the coffee. And in that situation, it was neither big business nor small business that was serving the needs of the farmers. they had as many problems with the local coyotes, as they're called, the local traders who come to the farms to buy their coffee and were offering them throwaway prices for good quality coffee, as they did have with the vast, powerful trading houses of big business who were doing exactly the same. And so I suppose the answer, I mean, this might get a bit boring, sorry, but I have to agree that the answer is no. Of course it's not a contradiction to say that big business can do ethical sourcing. It's not a contradiction, but it is full of contradictions. And it strikes me the question then is, how do we manage those contradictions the best? Because the implicit counterpoint of the question, I guess, is that maybe small is beautiful, that small business can always be more ethical. And there is no doubt that there are many companies who have the ethical 5 stars, who are the small pioneering brands who can indeed do really new and exciting things in the ethical field and can actually be among the first to explore new ways of working. And in fact, if some of you have ever tried the delicious chocolate bars upstairs in Starbucks, they're made by Divine Chocolate, a very small pioneering company that is indeed part owned by Kwapa Cocoa, the farmers in Ghana, who are then really trying out a whole new model of how to do ethical sourcing that takes it to the next level, where actually the farmer organisation themselves part own the company. And that they are then absolutely together on how to solve the problems that Kwapa Cocoa in Ghana faces. Because if you part own each other, then when the farmers hit a problem, whether it's with difficulties getting credit, whether it's problems with diseases on their farms, whether it's problems with trading, whatever it is, you're part and parcel of those problems as a company. If you're buying from those farmers, you know them, you sit on boards together, you go to their AGM, you see the thousands of farmers who come together to celebrate Kwapa Cocoa and the cooperative and all it's doing in the villages. And so obviously there are examples where small is beautiful and it can be nimble and move into whole new areas. And by contrast, big business of course can be removed from the coal face, if you like. That at its worst, you do have a situation where companies simply have no idea where, for example, their cotton or perhaps their cocoa butter or their shea butter is coming from. For example, cosmetics are made of often cocoa butter. Most companies in the cosmetics world have no idea where that is coming from. In fact, it's probably never crossed their mind to even ask or think about where it's coming. They're buying on the spot market, another trader, another trader, another trader down the line is dealing with the farmers. And in those situations, of course, you've actually got corporate layers removing you from the problems that the farmers are facing every day. And that means, of course, it is then easier to push down on prices because actually you're not the one having to deal with the consequences of those price cuts. You're facing pressure from your customers, from your shareholders to increase profits, to increase the profit margin all the time. You're facing pressure from the competition. And we know how often the problem is, as Churchill said, that the good are undercut by the bad by the worse. And so big business is facing all those pressures from the customers, from the consumer, from their shareholders, but they're not necessarily facing that same pressure from the communities who are growing the products. And indeed, they're often insulated from them by being removed. And that's the contradictions that we need to change. Above all else, it is those inherent contradictions within big business that it is, I think, our collective responsibility to begin to change. And so I don't think it's just about saying, well, business should clean up their act. I think this is absolutely a collective endeavour, if you like, to think, how do we change the very society expectations within which business is then operating? So that the city analyst, for example, will look more at how is business doing on the ethical scorecard, and not just that, what's the profit rate of return. So that the consumer, for example, increasingly demands ethical sourcing from big business. And I think that is the most significant shift that we've seen over the past 20 years, and I think will only escalate. is the scale of consumer interest in company sourcing practices. And I think it's one of the great things. We're here at the start of Fair Trade Fortnight, and Starbucks are always fantastic about swinging in behind Fortnight. And we're actually celebrating the fact that sales of fair trade products in this country have now broken through the £1 billion barrier and grew last year 40% in the toughest economic times. And I think that is real credit to the public, who are absolutely saying to big business, you know, we're giving you a license to operate ethically. We want you to engage with the farmers and workers on whom you depend. And I think it's making sure that we are changing those parameters of competition that you mentioned, that falls to all of us. And then within that, absolutely, big business can play a critical role in bringing about change. Because of course, what big business has on its side is its scale. Big business can really transform the positioning of ethical sourcing. So the small pioneer brands can be out there paving the way, but at the end of the day, of course, they are small, and therefore their impact is inevitably smaller. What big business can do is really take that to scale. So to go back, for example, to the example of Kwaba Cocoa in Ghana, they had been selling about 5,000 tonnes a year of their cocoa on fair trade terms. When Cadbury Dairy Milk went fair trade, they're now selling 20,000 tonnes of their cocoa on fair trade terms. And what that does is, of course, transform their possibilities to bring about change within their communities. They now have what is thought to be the largest farmer-owned traceability system in the world, working with Twin Trading and Divine, who've been their partners from the beginning, but then really able to take that to scale, able to reach many more farmers and to work with them, whether it's on bringing healthcare needs or whether it's on meeting productivity. And they are now a player. And their position from being a niche that people could laugh at to becoming a really major player within the cocoa industry is, of course, transformed by scale. And I think I personally actually saw the same when we went to Rwanda with Starbucks. And in fact, I don't know if you know, the president of Rwanda has instigated a really interesting policy where he's absolutely clear that if he's going to tackle poverty and drive economic growth in his country, which he absolutely needs to do if he's going to really maintain the peace and build that economic underpinning of peace, then he has got a ruthless drive on supporting smallholders. And he said we must put the smallholder at the heart of our economic policy, but connecting the smallholder with big business. And so the president of Rwanda has gone out of his way, he's gone around the world courting big business and saying to them, come and invest in Rwanda, because we need the not only the direct investment and the muscle and the might you bring, but also the leverage. That begins to transform the way people see Rwanda and the possibilities for that country. And so one of the business leaders whom the president has established a relationship with is indeed Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks globally, who have then invested in Rwanda, building, for example, farmer centres where the farmers can learn how to cup and improve the quality of their coffee. So really investing back in the farmers, but bringing with it that scale and reach that larger companies can bring. And so I think the question then, the challenge is, how does big business engage, and how can we help, above all else, address the inevitable power imbalance that comes if you have millions of smallholders selling to a few big companies. And at the heart of that, I think we believe in fair trade must always be about farmer organisation and knowledge and access to information, so that they then also begin to have the skills with which to discuss and negotiate. And it is also about both the companies and the farmers finding that right balance between neither being too reliant on each other, but actually both finding ways to strengthen their relationship. One example would be Merlin de Preza, as the president of the Latin American Coffee Growers, and she runs a very successful cooperative in Nicaragua called Product Co-op, who indeed supply some of the fair trade coffee to Starbucks. Now, she's very pleased to be selling some of her coffee to Starbucks. She's very pleased to be one of the leaders in fair trade. She's also absolutely clear she's not going to rely only on either fair trade or one company, Starbucks. That she's going to have for her farmers a spread that she's going to sell some shade-grown coffee, some organic, some fair trade. She's going to sell to absolutely dedicated companies like Cafe Direct that they've been part of helping found and nurture, as well as selling to big companies like Starbucks. And I think it's helping us find that right mix, so the relationship and the dependence on both sides is right. Farmers need that predictability. They need to know that they can sell to a partner who is with them, who understands and shares their problems. And on the other hand, they don't want to lurch from one form of dependency into another. So I guess the trick for all of us is how to get that relationship working at its best for both parties. And I think that's when it gets, that's when this debate begins to get really interesting, when it's actually no longer about is ethics, ethical also a good or a bad thing, is business good or bad, it's actually how do we do it, and how do we help. In the end, I guess what we all want to see is that the small farmers of the world can themselves become the big businessmen of tomorrow. Thanks very much.
Harriet, thanks very much indeed for that, and for leading us on into some questions where we may be able to involve our audience. So we've heard that one of the fundamental things about fair trade, I think both our speakers are saying, is about these lasting relationships, and all lasting relationships are about continuing negotiation. And so that's one of the areas we have. The other thing is this notion of predictability, of continuity, of being able to rely on something even when the commodity prices fluctuate wildly, as they have been doing and as they are doubtless going to do in the future. So with that, I'd like to, as I said, because Jeremy has to leave us a little before the end, I wanted to open the discussion up now to people who have questions, and also people who have any direct experience that they'd like to share at this point in a relatively brief and to the point sort of way. I think I'm picking up that there may be a microphone travelling around to facilitate this. And there's someone right at the back in front of the picture of Bear Grylls, which is staring at me. Not that I'm paranoid. If you could say who you are when you get a chance, that would be lovely.
Thank you very much. It's Fiona Gooch from Tradecraft. Nice to see you, Harriet. Nice to see you, Jeremy. Question to both of you, Harriet, because you said inevitably there are contradictions in how big business does ethical sourcing, and it is the context of how the market works. The question to both of you are, what are the policy changes we need to be bringing about as the British government to shape trade so that it systematically benefits, or certainly doesn't undermine poor farmers, which is what the current context can do in the big picture?
Jeremy, would you like to start on that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very difficult one. I suppose from my background, I'm fairly anti too much intervention in markets. I tend to see that in Britain, what can we do? In Britain, I think we have to make sure, and this is not necessarily something for government, this is more for the actual the marks themselves, to ensure that those marks are credible. The fair trade marks, the organic marks, cafe practices and so on. And because what we can see is that people will tick all the boxes, try and operate to the lowest common denominator of those particular marks. And I think I come again to the driving force that the Fair Trade Foundation is in this movement, where I think it will literally keep everybody else up to the mark. I'm not sure that government can do a huge amount other than to ensure that the normal rules, trading rules, about doing what you say you're doing, ensuring you're not deceiving the customer in what you say. So if you say you're paying a minimum price, if you say that you're not using child labour, if you say that you're conforming to environmental standards, that you actually are doing those, I think it will be very difficult to enshrine them in law, because if we look at the success of the fair trade movement in the UK, which Harriet's outlined, why is that the case? I think that's the case because we have one that has been quite market driven, that has said actually what matters is what is done on the ground. It is not a particularly political movement in the sense that you have more mainstream support from across the political spectrum for it. If we were to get more into you must do this, you must do that, then I feel that some of that support, particularly if you like from my side of the political divide, might sort of wane.
I just want to follow up very briefly on that. Do you think one part of the credibility is a sense of how much of the margin is going back to producers? It's something that I come across when people talk to me.
Yeah, and I think that's perhaps something that people could do a lot more on. There isn't a great deal of talk about it, apart from fair trade itself, where you have minimum price guarantees, and there are one or two of the other marks have certain specifications about price, but they aren't nearly of the same order as the fair trade price guarantee. I think it would be good if the users of fair trade labels or ethical labels were to make it more clear what margins are going where. And I think that's again something where, if you like, the original brands, the Cafe Directs, and so on, have and can take a lead. I mean, there was a study done a few years ago which showed that in the Netherlands, supermarkets actually make considerably larger margins on fair trade products than they did on the conventional products. Now, I think the public probably needs to know that. They need to know that the supermarkets are making the same sort of margins, the reasonable margins. They're treating fair trade, if you like, fairly, and not seeing it as something which they can exploit for higher margins. But again, I think that's got to be driven by organisations, or could be driven by organisations like Fair Trade, and saying let's have a bit more transparency here. But it takes cooperation, and it takes leadership, I think, rather than law. Because if you do it by law, you end up with people trying to circumvent the law legally and trying to find the lowest common denominator. Whereas if you almost have a name and shame policy or encouragement policy, I think you end up with a better approach. And that's why Fair Trade in the UK has been so successful.
Can't help wondering if that doesn't take us into one of the contradictions. If you get larger margins, that will of course be a driver for fair trade and ethical sourcing throughout the business world. Harriet, I wonder if you had anything. I'm sure you.
Well, I'm sure Fiona has the answer to the question, but I can think of four possible areas. Three possible areas and one question. And the question I always struggle with is, how can the city really help support the move to ethical sourcing? Because it seems to me that's absolutely critical that we get the financial powerhouses and the analysts really ready to perhaps see a lower profit margin if in the end that's helping a company do the right thing, which may deliver, of course, immediate profit, both from the fact in driving consumer demand, in meeting consumer demand, in building sustainable supply chains, in building employee satisfaction, but may also be a cost, and it may also be a hit. And there are many companies, including Starbucks, for example, who didn't put up the price of their coffee when they went 100% fair trade in the UK and indeed right across Europe and the Middle East. And so some companies are investing back. And for me, the real interest is how can we help ensure that the city takes that more into account. But I think there are three possible areas where we need government action. One, which is being looked at, is the possibility of a supermarket ombudsman. And obviously that only relates to one part of big business, but at the end of the day, of course, the retail sector is absolutely critical and huge for many farmers within commodities. And I think the possibility that we need an ombudsman with teeth, where companies really do feel that they can go and in security raise concerns, is really a key plank, and I hope that that does indeed come to pass as soon as possible. Secondly is absolutely the need for intervention in global trade rules. Obviously there's a lot that governments can do to make world trade rules as a whole fairer. So it's not about particular one business or another, but actually about the whole playing field within businesses, within which business is operating. The most heinous example of that is the fact that the US and the EU are still subsidising cotton farmers who grow too much cotton, dump it on world markets, and that's pulling down the price for West African cotton farmers. And actually, the quicker we can see some of those world trade rules changed, the better. And I think that's where government probably has a clearest role to play. And I suppose the last area, which is much unclear, is about how can government intervene to manage commodity markets. Now, it's been very fashionable over the past years to walk away from any idea of governments intervening at that kind of level, but it was actually one of the 4 pillars when the World Bank, the IMF was set up after the World War. One of the pillars that they looked at building into global architecture was management of commodities, and in the end that never happened. And indeed what there had been, the International Coffee Agreement, was in the rush to liberalisation torn up. And that's when some of the first biggest problems in coffee kicked in. And I think it would be really interesting to take that debate now, to think together again in a new climate about how could governments or countries and companies and producers come together to manage commodities better at a global level. Because it's absolutely clear in the past 20 years that it's not working how it is now.
Any more questions at this stage? Yes, gentleman over there.
Hi, Jeffrey Young from the Labour Strategies. A question for Harriet is, how has the increased price of coffee over the last few years impacting fair trade in general? Obviously it's a sort of a market question here as well.
Over in recent years we've seen coffee prices rising. And obviously that's good news, and in fact it's not just in coffee. We've seen prices rising in coffee, in cocoa, in a number of other commodities. But I think what you have to look at is the long-term trend. And if we look at what's happened over the past 40 years, the real price of coffee has fallen by 58%. The real price of cocoa has fallen by over 50%. And it's the same in bananas, it's the same in sugar. And so the real price is in long-term decline. We see a slight tick, if you like, at the minute, going up slightly, but it is nowhere near compensating for decades of neglect and the ruthless driving down of prices. And I think we also have to see it in the context that, well, the farmers are now getting higher prices for their coffee. They're actually also having to pay more for their food. And most farmers are actually net purchasers of food. And we first did some research on this 2 years ago when food prices first started rising. We thought, well, what would be the impact for fair trade farmers? And some of them were getting higher prices because when the market goes high, at that point the fair trade price is the market price. When the market goes above the fair trade price, then you have to pay the market price plus the fair trade premium. So they weren't getting more for their products, but they were paying much more to buy food. And so some sugar growers, for example, in Malawi, had gone from spending half their income on food to spending 80% of their income on food, even though they were getting a higher income. And so I think, obviously, we welcome the rising of coffee prices, and long may it continue, because the worry for farmers is always unpredictability. As actually Jeremy mentioned, that's actually the stability and security is as important for them as the height of the price. And actually over the past 10 years, the fair trade minimum price has kicked in 70% of the time. So we've had within that very short period of time, in fact in the past 15 years I think, no, in the past 10 years we've had coffee prices at all-time lows and all-time highs. And that's the kind of unpredictability that farmers are living with. And I guess what our collective responsibility is how to even that out as much as we can. And that would be where ethical companies can really play their part in actually saying ahead of time to producers, you know, we'll pay you this much and we'll give you pre-financing, so they have security to plan for the future and invest in their businesses. And of course, you know, I mean, like any business, farmers will only invest if they have security of income coming in. So I think that's the trick for us, but long may the price rises continue in commodities actually, and we'll just have to pay more for our food. Now, the minute we pay, in Britain we spend on average 9% of our income on food and drink. And the average farmer in Congo spends 90% of their income on food and drink. And I think it's really interesting the way whenever oil prices rise, everyone just says, yes, well that will feed through into food price rises and that will feed through into inflation, and it's sort of accepted. Oil price rises, food prices rise. Well, okay, well what about food price rising because we're not exploiting the farmers anymore? And that will have to feed through. And I know those are really difficult debates to have at tough times when lots of people are feeling the pinch, but actually lots of people do also have enough to pay a bit more for the food and drink and begin to really value it more. And I always think, particularly when you hear people say, a third of food gets wasted. A third of food gets wasted. Well, if we could cut back on waste and buy less, we could pay more for that food. That would seem to be a better way to be running our global food system.
Thanks very much, Harriet. Any other questions, particularly for Jeremy, who had to leave us very shortly? Someone who I can't see behind a pillar.
I'll let the panel see me as well. Matthew Whitaker, Resolution Foundation. It's slightly off topic, I suppose, but we're interested in the domestic context of all this, I guess. We've just started looking at issues around things like living wage and fair pay for people in the UK and big businesses in particular, ensuring not just that they're paying their staff a certain wage, but paying people in their supply, or ensuring that their suppliers are paying a living wage. And we're interested in the economics of this and whether it works. And I'm just interested in today in whether that clashes with fair trade principles, and actually if businesses are spending some of their margins on domestic staff in the UK, what does that then mean for their ability to source ethically elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. It's one that's that I've often thought about, because at the end, what often happens is that the people look at coffee prices and they say, actually, the coffee farmer only gets 5% of the price in Starbucks or wherever, and they forget that most of the cost in bringing a cup of coffee is the fixed cost of rent, of staff, and so on. And I think it's essential that all the way down the chain, people are constantly looking, if they're a true believer in ethical sourcing and running their business in an ethical way, are looking at every aspect of that. Are they paying a fair price to farmers? Are they paying a fair price, a fair wage to their staff in the UK or wherever they're operating? What's happening about the transport between the origin country and so on? Are they using transport companies which operate in an ethical way, or are they somewhere along the chain? Is there something which actually they're squeezing so hard that it's resulting in a very unfair trade practices? And I think it's a challenge to everyone to look at every part of their operation. And yes, it does often mean that costs will be higher, and let nobody be under any illusion that ethical sourcing does result in higher costs. But as Harriet has said, we spend very little compared with other people of our income on food. The Economist this week had an article on food security, and that to me is probably the single major problem facing the world, or one of the 2 or 3 major problems facing the world at the moment. But let's also remember that one thing that ethical sourcing does is improve quality. There is no doubt about that. There is no, in my experience, if we remember back to the old fair trade of the 70s and 80s, it happened. We had this sort of Nicaragua coffee, which was a very good attempt to pay fair prices, but the quality wasn't very high, the campaign coffee and so on. What the fair trade movement did in the 90s was to say, actually, if people are going to pay this extra premium for fair trade and for ethical sourcing, they want quality. And then people will buy it again and again, and you get this continuity of relationship. So in order to go back to your question, in order to ensure that there is fairness across the chain, right from the farmer to the person who works in a coffee shop like this, we have to expect a higher price at the end. But at the same time, for that, we're getting higher quality and a certainty that it has been sourced throughout the chain in an ethical way.
Okay. Do you have any more time, or?
Yeah, a few more minutes. Yeah.
Any other questions at this stage?
I've got a point I wish to make, if I can. Just a couple of points picking up on what the panel said. I think 2 things. One is just responding on behalf of business and what goes into our mind around that whole area. There is actually a disconnect somewhat, but not entirely, between the price of raw material and the price we charge the consumer. Because you have to take into account all of the costs, not just, in our case, coffee input costs, but also, as one of the questioners pointed out, labor, the property costs are one of the biggest costs that we have. You have to take all of those things into account, and it's all of those things that make up the selling price of the coffee. So it's not just that. So and sometimes consumers are prepared to pay a higher price, for quality. It largely depends. So there is a correlation, but there's also a disconnect. I think the other thing back to the point on ethical sourcing and price, the price paid is not the only way to help farmers. And this notion of yield, I think, is probably way more important. Just as Harriet said, farmers hate volatility, business hates volatility too. I mean, that's the thing. We can deal with high pricing. We don't like to deal with huge fluctuations. And this notion of what we're trying to do on the ground is as Harriet said, in Rwanda or in East Africa, is help the farmers improve their yield. Because they're producing in Rwanda 7 bags of coffee per hectare of land. They're producing 30 in Costa Rica and 100 in Brazil. So if we can teach the farmers how to improve yield through right husbandry, through all the right farming techniques, and get them from 7 to 14 bags, we've doubled their income without increasing their costs. That's a much bigger contribution than paying an extra 10 cents a pound. So I think yield is an extremely important part of that.
Anyone else on the floor at this point? Okay, please. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Well, we heard a lot in the first 2 presentations about the importance of forging relationships, and it's almost by magic we have as a third speaker someone whose focus is on value chain development. Jonathan Mitchell is Head of Programme in Private Sectors and Markets at the Overseas Development Institute, and he's a economic development specialist whose experience is mostly in Sub-Saharan Africa, but increasingly in Southeast Asia. John.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Chair, and thank you for coming this morning. It's quite a tricky time actually to have my surname in development. I was on the phone with someone last night and being treated with more than usual respect. And tried to get to the bottom of this, and what it was is he thought I was Andrew Mitchell, Secretary of State for International Development. I'm not, I'm Jonathan Mitchell, and I work at a development policy think tank here in London. I've been asked to be slightly controversial and give a more economics viewpoint to this. So I do actually agree with a lot of what's said. I mean, that seems to be common in panel sessions at the moment. But what I'm going to do is emphasise the differences, just to stimulate debate. A lot of people find it really hard to believe that big business can have a positive impact on development, and particularly big foreign business. I don't. My job is to go to developing countries and to look at the supply chain from these big businesses and find out who's actually making the stuff. I've seen some pretty horrible things, but generally horrible things in terms of social and environmental performance. But generally, what we find is that the benefit of business to developing countries, including a lot of the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world, is positive. It's a benign impact. And we've spent a lot of time looking at the tourist sector, big nasty hotels, if you actually look at where the food is grown, that tourists eat. Very often it's some of the poorest communities, the most marginalised communities. Within the agriculture sector, similarly, that big business provides a stable market which your small producer can access, and it benefits them very significantly. For instance, we often find in the tourist sector that 25% of the money that's spent within a country, so $1 in every $4 you spend, actually accrues directly or indirectly to a poor household. And as a result of that, countries can very rapidly move out of low-income status into middle-income status. So the point is that there are rather more win-wins, we think, and that's just having looked at it, not approaching it ideologically, rather more win-wins, meaning a win for business and a win for poor people, than you'd expect. The point is, though, that I think this gets a bit confused when you combine it with ethics. because most business isn't ethical. Most business is trying to make a return, and its primary driver is not ethics. So we have a paradoxical situation that we're looking generally at non-ethical business that's having a strong development impact. And I just raised a question with you this morning. Is that necessarily a bad thing? We're working currently with some of the most marginalised rural producers in Tanzania. And if you were one of those people and your family's welfare was dependent on trade, would you be more comfortable to think that your family's welfare was dependent on the generosity of a stranger, or just that there was a strong business case for the cotton ginnery in this case buying your product because it's a good product? I would suggest that actually having a business case behind your livelihood, people buying things because you do it well, could be more reliable in the long term. The point is, though, that these kind of partnerships do have risks. Development is about power, and I think Harriet made the point very strongly. And there is a massive disparity in power between an individual smallholder and a large business. And that power disparity can be abused, and plenty of examples of that. I think there's another issue, again, to just sort of push the envelope a little bit. We don't expect NGOs to know about business, and we don't expect donors and smallholders to know about business. But we do expect business to know about business. And it has really struck me that when we're dealing with mainstream business, so not fair trade, just mainstream business, we spend a lot of time developing a very elaborate business case for having a more developmental impact. And sometimes it's resisted, even when you can demonstrate that it would be more profitable, that it's not more difficult to do. Sometimes business will resist making those changes which will benefit them and benefit their supply chain. And last week I had a very ethical person working within mainstream business just weeping on my shoulder because she could not convince her board to make a change that was actually in their interests. I think also a point that has been raised is this irresponsibility of linking small producers to volatile sources of demand. And we're currently doing some work with the World Food Programme, and they're doing a lot of work. They're spending $1 billion a year buying the grain that they feed displaced people from, they're buying it from small producers. So rather than dumping cheap grain from America onto Africa, destroying local markets, they're actually really trying to buy the grain from very small, very poor producers. Now, this is a source of demand that in a sense you want to go away. I mean, this is food aid, this is people's last chance when everything else has gone away. And the point is that it doesn't. Next week I'm going to Uganda, and because of the end of hostilities in Uganda, the demand for food aid has actually reduced. But South Sudan is now coming on the stream. So my point is that actually, although we're dealing with a lot of volatility in international markets, that that can be overemphasized, and actually big businesses, big enterprises can provide a very constant source of demand. So big business is often better for development than we'd expect, even though it's not from an ethical perspective. Now, just to be controversial here, does the converse hold for ethical trade? Are we living in an Alice in Wonderland world where business is good for development and ethical trade is not? I'll raise this question. My feeling is that in part, yes. We in the Overseas Development Institute, we've looked at a lot of ethical trade certification schemes, and some particularly the ones that are purely environmental or have a very strong environmental focus. For instance, the Forest Stewardship Council, the Marine Stewardship Council, have huge compliance costs. We've talked about that a bit already. And they are an effective barrier to stop developing country producers get certification and be able to access those schemes. I think the danger is that they sound attractive to Western consumers, but can inadvertently function as a kind of protectionism against poor producers. Personally, I feel that fair trade is completely different from that. I think it's always had a very strong developmental focus. It's about trying to help people as well as the environment. And it clearly does, and I say this on the basis of going and counting things, it clearly does generate materially better conditions for both producers but also people living in the surrounding communities where fair trade premium prices actually pull up prices for people who are even outside the scheme. There's a very active debate within development circles about how good fair trade is, and there's certainly differences of opinion in lots of different organisations, including mine. I agree that I think it would be good to have more transparency in terms of when the consumer pays a bit more for a fairly traded good, who gets the money from that. I think that would be a good idea. There are clearly examples where you have cooperatives and producer organisations where sometimes the money is misappropriated. I know it's a major concern, and I think we have to remain vigilant to that. And finally, I think we do need to keep our eye on the ball, that if we're trying to help poor people as well as the environment in developing countries, we need to make sure that our certification schemes aren't so complicated that they block out the very poor people that we're trying to help. However, I think fair trade works extremely well. And I think that actually it's been pioneering and a progressive force. I think it's helped both business and the development sector realise some really important things. I think the way that fair trade is based on a market logic. 20 years ago, I stood outside Safeway in northeast London with my little Cafe Direct stall. We were campaigning to get fairly traded coffee out of charity shops selling 3 boxes a week into the supermarkets. We've done it. And you've got a way, and actually the margins that supermarkets get from it has allowed the alignment, the incentives to do good, but also to do what's financially sensible. And I admire that. I think that was a very far-sighted thing to do, and I think that's the reason that you've got the market share that you have in a number of product lines. I also think that I respect the way that the Fair Trade Foundation is grappling with this tricky issue of to what extent do you bend your principles in order to change the world. It'd be quite easy for Harriet to say a huge proportion of everything that you buy under the Fair Trade label has to go directly to the producers, in which case we'd be back in the land of selling 3 boxes of coffee and not actually even helping very many of the people that we're trying to help. I really like the pragmatism that Fair Trade Foundation has, which is, okay, we're going to work with business, we're going to compromise on some of these very ideologically sound but practically unconstructive positions. And we're going to talk with plantation agriculture. We're going to see if there's a way that we can move fair trade, something that's good and small, into something that's nearly as good and huge and actually changes more of the lives of the billion people that went to bed hungry last night. And finally, I really strongly agree with the viewpoints that were made by both speakers, that it is about, when you're trying to develop a value chain, it's partly about price, but it's also about those longer term relationships and realising that people need help to access markets. And that is what I think that Fair Trade Foundation has really shown the development sector. So I do agree that business is, and ethical sourcing is not a contradiction. I do think that business is generally good for development, even though it's not ethics driven. And I do worry about some ethical sourcing, which is doing a very brisk trade in European markets, but might actually be placing the interests of poor people in developing countries below the environment in the South. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Price, ethics, economics, lots of questions, I'm sure. So some more questions from the floor, please. Lady there.
Hi, thank you. My name is Maria Hannon, I'm from Glass Marcella. It was just a question really around whether, in your view, fair trade might be hampering efforts towards free trade and towards opening up the markets, and could be seen to be something that governments point to and say, well, look, we're increasing efforts towards fair trade, so we don't necessarily need to bring down some of the protectionist barriers.
Should we take a number of questions? Okay, let's take 2 or 3 at a time. Any other questions? Lady behind you.
Helen Knowlton. I was struck by the last speaker who was talking very much in terms of ethics and doing good. Surely the real strength is when the commercial and business case comes together with the development case, so that the one is the same.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, let's go with those two. And Howard, would you like to go first?
Why don't I take the first question, if that's all right? I hope, on the contrary, I hope that as we build a fair trade movement, it actually is giving a mandate to governments to create the big, bold changes that they need to do in world trade rules. Because actually, obviously, governments, like businesses, operate within society, and they can only go as far as society allows them to go. And if they feel that the only thing that society cares about is maintaining the common agricultural policy, well, that constrains their capacity to make the kind of changes we need from a development perspective. But if they feel that there's a groundswell of support and the public is saying we need trade to be fairer, then that gives them the permission, and it also politically makes sense for them to then really drive forward those changes. And so, I mean, I know that the rising sales of fair trade can be seen as a proxy by government ministers for the strength of public support for trade justice as a whole. And that hopefully our whole campaign around fair trade cotton, for example, is putting the spotlight on the problem that otherwise just gets brushed under the table, very conveniently gets forgotten about. Whereas when the whole fair trade movement is out there campaigning on fair trade cotton, the businesses are getting behind fair trade cotton, and the people are then writing to them, government ministers, and they can say, I'm ready to put my money where my mouth is. I believe in trade justice. Now we need you to do that. I think it really helps government make those moves. Now, they haven't got there yet. We didn't get a Doha development round. We haven't got a fair deal in global trade talks. But I really hope that as the movement for fair trade builds, it so with it too builds pressure on government to make those changes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think that in a way the ideal would be that fair trade goes away. And it becomes the mainstream. I think that it's a pioneer. It's trying to demonstrate something works, and it does. It's still too small, which is why I absolutely support the idea of trying to get it more into mainstream rather than just niche trade. But the day I look forward to is when it goes away, because all trade is fairer. And I think that, you know, we had the discussion earlier about what policy changes could be made. Obviously looking at Western governments, I think there's some very good points there. But what about Southern governments as well? What about actually having some form of minimum wage or living wage legislation in the South? Because fair trade has always got to be a plan B if you don't have a proper regulatory, public, democratically accountable function, policy function. You only need fair trade because you don't have that. And if you did have proper public policy made across countries that was internationally coordinated, so countries weren't played off against each other, that would achieve what fair trade has achieved in a couple of decades for some particular product lines across the whole spectrum, have a dramatic effect. So that's plan A for me, which changed the policy. Meanwhile, we don't have that, so let's push on with plan B and try and get policy changed. And absolutely the point about the bringing ethics and business together as a win-win, completely agree with that. What I find intriguing about it, though, is that that isn't what's driving a lot of business people. That's the outcome that they achieve, having not intended to achieve that. And what I find striking is going in and presenting to company boards that actually they're having a dramatically positive development impact when they hadn't really thought about it before. That's what I find odd. I admire people that are very principled and say, I want to change the world, and they achieve it. That's great. I'm intrigued by people that don't necessarily want to change the world and achieve that.
Thank you. Changing the world, fair trade is plan B. Lots to talk about. Any further questions from the floor? You're very quiet this morning. No? Okay. Any closing comments?
Well, I'm happy to say thank you very much to Starbucks for hosting with your lovely coffee and conversation. What could be better? So I think it's really fantastic. And so I think everyone has a great Fair Trade Fortnight from my point of view.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate that. I think it was fantastic, slightly earlier than most meetings in London, but brilliant and really nice coffee. Thank you.